The storm had been building over the Kessa Hills since noon, and by the time it broke, Ethan Cross was already resigned to another quiet evening alone in his grandfather's manor. He sat at the workbench in the east parlor, an old brass astrolabe disassembled in neat rows before him, gears and pins organized by size the way his grandfather had taught him. Outside, the rain came down in sheets against the tall windows, and thunder rolled somewhere far off over the Feline Kingdom's border hills. Astera had never been a world that made much room for people like Ethan. Humanity was a minority here, a handful of scattered settlements tucked between the territories of a dozen advanced, older civilizations, the avian Skitherans to the north, the stone-skinned Drommer in the deep valleys, and closest of all, just past the ridge that marked his eastern property line, the Feline Kingdom, with its ancient bloodlines and its endless, exhausting court politics. Ethan wanted none of it. He'd inherited the manor 3 years ago, when his grandfather passed, and he'd been happy to let the rest of the world forget he existed. He fixed things. He grew vegetables. He read by lamplight and went to bed early. It was not an exciting life, but it was his, and after the losses that had brought him back to this house in the first place, exciting was the last thing he wanted. He hadn't always been so content with solitude. There had been a time, right after his parents relocated south and his grandfather's health began its slow decline, when Ethan had imagined a very different future for himself: university in the capital, maybe, or an apprenticeship with one of the great engineering guilds that served the Skitheran sky cities. He'd had ambitions once. But watching his grandfather fade, watching the old man's hands shake too badly to hold a screwdriver, something in Ethan had quietly rearranged its priorities. He'd come home. He'd stayed. And when his grandfather finally passed in his sleep on a spring morning 3 years back, Ethan had simply kept staying, as though leaving now would somehow undo all the years he'd spent choosing to remain. The manor itself was a sprawling, weathered thing, 3 stories of gray stone and dark timber, built by some ancestor who'd clearly had grander ambitions for the family than a single reclusive engineer rattling around inside it. Half the rooms hadn't seen use in a decade. The garden, once his grandmother's pride, had gone to seed years before Ethan was even born, reclaimed by wildflowers and stubborn ivy that crept up the eastern wall like it meant to swallow the whole building eventually. A knock at the door broke the rhythm of the storm. He frowned, setting down a tiny brass gear, and glanced at the old clock on the mantel. 9:30. No one visited the manor. Not delivery drones, not neighbors, not even the tax assessor bothered to make the trip out this far anymore. The nearest town was a 2-hour ride, and the road connecting it to his gate was barely more than a rutted track, washed out more often than not by weather exactly like tonight's. The knock came again, softer this time, almost apologetic. Ethan crossed the hall, boots echoing on the worn floorboards, and opened the heavy front door to a gust of cold, rain-soaked wind. A young woman stood on the stone step, drenched to the bone, a single battered suitcase gripped in both hands like it contained everything she owned in the world. A dark hood was pulled low over her head, shadowing her face, and she was shivering so hard he could see it from the doorway. "I'm sorry to intrude," she said, and her voice was steadier than her trembling shoulders had any right to be. "I saw the light. I was hoping, I know this is forward, but I'm looking for work. Housekeeping. Anything. I can cook, I can clean, I don't need much." Ethan stared at her for a long moment. Lightning cracked somewhere behind her, briefly illuminating sharp cheekbones and eyes that glinted an unusual shade of gold beneath the hood. "You're going to catch your death standing out there," he said finally, stepping back and pulling the door wider. "Come in before you drown." She hesitated, just a fraction of a second, as if she hadn't expected kindness to come so easily, and then stepped over the threshold, setting her suitcase down with a care that seemed almost reverent, like the case held glass instead of clothes. "Thank you," she said. "Truly. I mean it. Don't thank me yet. This house doesn't have much to offer. It's just me out here." He gestured toward the hearth in the front room, where the fire still crackled low. "Warm up. I'll get you a towel and something dry to change into. We can talk about work after you're not actively freezing. She lowered her hood as she moved toward the fire, and Ethan caught his first real look at her, a cascade of dark hair, damp and clinging to her neck, and two feline ears, sleek and dark-tipped, folded flat against her skull in a way that made her look smaller, more uncertain than her posture suggested. Her features were striking in the firelight: high cheekbones, a proud jaw, eyes that were entirely too composed for someone who had just been standing in a thunderstorm. He'd guessed as much from the ears, obviously. A feline from the kingdom next door, clearly, though something about the way she held herself struck him as different from the merchants and travelers he occasionally saw passing through town. There was a stillness to her, a controlled elegance, like a dancer trying very hard to stand like an ordinary person. I should tell you, she said, watching the fire rather than him, that I don't have references. Or a very good work history. I know that's not ideal for a housekeeper. I wasn't looking to hire a housekeeper, Ethan admitted, draping a wool blanket over her shoulders. But I suppose I could use one. This place has gotten away from me a bit. That was an understatement. Half the west wing was under dust sheets. The garden had gone feral. He hadn't cooked a proper meal in longer than he cared to admit. My name is Luna, she said, after a pause that felt just slightly too long, as though she needed the extra second to remember which name she was using. I can start tomorrow, if that suits you. Ethan, he said. Ethan Cross. And tonight's fine, if you don't mind sleeping in a room that hasn't been aired out in a year. For the first time, something like real warmth broke through her composure, a small, surprised smile. I don't mind at all, Mr. Cross. I think I've had quite enough of finely made beds. He didn't ask what she meant by that. It would be a long time before he understood. He showed her to a guest room on the second floor, apologizing for the dust, for the sheet-covered furniture, for the general state of neglect that had crept over the manor in the years since his grandmother's passing. Luna waved off every apology with a graciousness that struck him as strange for someone claiming to be a penniless drifter. As though she'd been trained since childhood in the art of making a host feel entirely forgiven for any imperfection. It's more than I expected to find tonight, she told him, setting her suitcase on the narrow bed. Truly, Ethan. Thank you. He left her to settle in, and as he made his way back downstairs, he found himself already wondering, with a curiosity he hadn't felt in years, exactly what kind of story had brought a woman like that to his door in the middle of a storm. The next morning, Ethan woke to the smell of smoke. He bolted downstairs in his sleep clothes to find the kitchen thick with haze, the old cast-iron stove sputtering, and Luna standing over a ruined pan of eggs with an expression of pure, wounded confusion. It's not supposed to do that, she said, staring at the blackened mess as if it had personally betrayed her. I followed the instructions exactly. What instructions? She gestured vaguely, almost defensively, at a spot on the counter where there were no instructions at all. The general principle of eggs. Heat. Pan. Time. Ethan bit back a laugh, opened the window to clear the smoke, and gently took the pan from her hands. Have you ever actually cooked before? Of course, she said, a touch too quickly, chin lifting. Just not eggs. Specifically. In this particular manner. He didn't push it. Over the following days, a pattern emerged that both baffled and quietly delighted him. Luna approached every household task like a brilliant strategist walking into an unfamiliar battlefield. She understood the theory of laundry perfectly, could describe with total confidence the concept of a washing machine, and yet somehow managed to flood the utility room twice in 1 week. She swept floors with the posture of someone accustomed to watching others sweep floors. She folded linens with an efficiency that suggested she'd memorized the shape of the task without ever practicing it. The washing machine incident was, in Ethan's private opinion, the funniest thing he'd witnessed in years. He'd come in from the workshop to find Luna standing ankle-deep in suds, the old machine groaning ominously, its door hanging open at an angle that suggested she'd wrestled it there herself. It simply would not cooperate, she informed him, with the wounded dignity of a general reporting a lost battle. I gave it clear and reasonable instructions. It's a washing machine, Luna. It doesn't take instructions. Then how is one meant to know what it wants? You read the little dial. Or, in this case, you don't overload it with every piece of linen in the house at once. She looked, genuinely, like this had never occurred to her. Ah, she said. I see. That does seem obvious, in retrospect. He mopped up the flooded utility room with her, both of them laughing more than the disaster probably warranted, and it was only later, lying awake that night, that Ethan found himself turning over the strangeness of it all. A woman who spoke 3 dead languages he'd overheard her muttering to herself while dusting the library, who could identify the provenance of an antique vase at a glance, who nonetheless had never in her life operated a washing machine. And every so often, in unguarded moments, the mask slipped entirely. On her 4th day, a merchant came to the gate to deliver firewood, and Luna answered the door, drew herself up without thinking, and said, in a voice of unmistakable authority, "You may leave the delivery at the east gate. See that it's stacked properly this time." The merchant blinked. Ethan, coming up behind her, blinked harder. Luna seemed to hear her own words a half-second after she'd said them, and her ears flattened in visible horror. "I apologize. I meant, could you please leave it at the gate? If it's not too much trouble." The merchant, bewildered, simply nodded and hauled the wood around without comment. Ethan waited until the gate had shut before he turned to her, arms crossed, fighting a smile. "See that it's stacked properly this time?" he repeated. "I used to work somewhere very particular about firewood," Luna said stiffly, and marched back inside before he could ask any further questions. A similar moment happened the following week, when a village boy came round selling fresh fish from a cart, and Luna, examining his catch with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to inspecting far grander offerings, informed him crisply that the 3rd one is substandard and should be priced accordingly, before catching herself and hastily buying the fish anyway, substandard or not, apparently to smooth over her own outburst. The boy left utterly confused but considerably richer, and Ethan spent the rest of the afternoon trying not to laugh every time he caught Luna's eye. He let it go. He told himself it wasn't his business. That whatever had brought a clearly overeducated, clearly sheltered young woman to his doorstep in the middle of a thunderstorm was hers to keep, and that pressing her for answers would only chase away the first bit of company his manner had seen in years. He assumed, in the absence of better explanation, that she'd grown up somewhere strict and cloistered, a noble household, maybe, or a temple, and had simply never been allowed to do ordinary things for herself. It would explain the commanding tone. It would explain the confusion over eggs. It would not, as it turned out, come anywhere close to the truth. 2 weeks in, Ethan began teaching her to cook properly, and it became, without either of them quite naming it as such, the best part of his day. "You're holding the knife like you're afraid of it," he said one evening, standing behind her at the counter as she attempted, with fierce concentration, to dice an onion. "I am not afraid of a vegetable." "Then why does it look like you're defusing a bomb?" She shot him a sideways glare that had absolutely no heat behind it. "Perhaps I simply respect the blade." "Sure. Here." He reached around her, guiding her hand gently, showing her the right angle, the right pressure. "Curl your fingers under. Let the knuckle guide it." She went very still under his hands for a moment, stiller than the lesson required. And he wondered if he'd overstepped, until she exhaled and relaxed into the correction, and the onion, for the first time all week, came apart in even little cubes. "There," he said, stepping back. "You've successfully committed vegetable violence." "High praise," she said dryly, but she was smiling at the cutting board, and something in Ethan's chest turned over in a way he hadn't felt in a very long time. It became routine after that. Luna failing spectacularly at some new task, Ethan showing her the trick of it, the two of them slowly turning the neglected manor back into something resembling a home. She took to the garden with far more natural aptitude than she had the kitchen. She seemed to have an instinctive understanding of what plants needed, coaxing the overgrown beds back into order with a patience that surprised him. Within a month, the rose bushes that had gone woody and wild along the east wall were trimmed back into something like their old shape, and the vegetable beds his grandmother once tended were neat rows of turned earth, seedlings pushing up green and hopeful. "How do you know so much about roses and so little about eggs?" Ethan asked her one afternoon, watching her carefully train a climbing vine along a trellis he'd repaired. She considered the question with unusual seriousness. "I suppose," she said slowly, "gardens have always felt honest to me. A rose doesn't care who you are. It only cares whether you tend it properly." She glanced sideways at him. "Eggs, apparently, hold grudges." He laughed, and she smiled, and the sun caught the gold in her eyes in a way that made his breath catch, just slightly, before he managed to look away. She said once, with her hands buried in the dirt and dusk falling gold behind her, that she liked the garden because nothing here expects anything of me. It only asks to be tended. Ethan didn't ask what she meant by that either. But he thought about it for days. In the evenings they took to sitting on the back porch with mugs of tea, watching the twin moons rise over the hills, talking about nothing in particular. Books she'd apparently read but claimed to have heard about second-hand. Small philosophies about tending gardens and fixing old machines, half-formed jokes that made her laugh in a way that seemed to surprise her every time, as though laughter itself were a luxury she'd rationed too carefully for too long. "You don't ask me many questions," she said one night, tea cooling in her hands. "Should I? Most people would. About where I came from. Why I'm here." She glanced at him, gold eyes catching the moonlight. Why a girl shows up alone in a thunderstorm asking for work. Ethan considered this. "I figure everyone's allowed a chapter they don't want to talk about. I've got a few of my own." He nodded toward the dark shape of the manor behind them. "This house used to have a lot more people in it. My grandfather. My parents, when I was small, before they moved south. Even after Grandpa passed, I kept thinking I'd fill it back up eventually. Never did. Just me and the astrolabes." Luna was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It's not a sad story, mostly. Just a quiet one." He looked over at her. "You'll tell me yours when you're ready. Or you won't, and that's fine too. Either way, you can stay as long as you need." Something shifted in her expression then, something raw and unguarded that he'd never seen on her before, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Thank you, Ethan," she said softly. "You have no idea what that means to me." He didn't. Not yet. But he would. They fell into an easy rhythm after that night, mornings spent on chores, afternoons on the garden or Ethan's endless queue of antique repairs, evenings on the porch with tea going cold between them while they talked about everything and nothing. Luna asked endless questions about his work. How a broken astrolabe could be coaxed back to life, why he preferred fixing old machines to simply replacing them with newer models. "Because everything worth having," he told her once, turning a brass gear over in his palm, "is worth the effort of understanding why it broke in the first place." She'd gone very quiet at that, staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, and he wondered, not for the first time, exactly what part of her own life she saw reflected in his words. While the manor slowly came back to life, the Feline Kingdom was falling apart. News traveled slowly to Ethan's remote corner of the world, filtered through the monthly market runs into town and the occasional broadcast on the old radio in his workshop, but even he couldn't miss the growing unrest. Queen Celine Asherin, young, unmarried, and according to every report utterly vanished, had not been seen at court in nearly a month. The official statement from the palace called it a diplomatic retreat. The unofficial rumors called it everything from kidnapping to assassination to a quiet coup by one of the great noble houses eager to seize the throne in her absence. Ethan caught snippets of it on the radio while repairing a water pump. Talk of the broken betrothal to Prince Kalendromer, meant to seal a fragile peace between the Feline Kingdom and the Stone Valley Drommer territories after generations of border skirmishes. Talk of noble houses maneuvering, of royal knights fanning out across the continent, of a bounty, quiet, unofficial, but very real, offered for any information on the Queen's whereabouts. They say she vanished the night before the wedding contract was to be signed, the radio announcer intoned, voice crackling through static. House Kestrel has called for an emergency Regency Council, while House Vane insists the throne remain vacant pending the Queen's safe return. Meanwhile, Prince Kaelin Drommer's father has issued a formal statement suggesting the broken betrothal may be considered, and I quote, an insult demanding redress should the marriage not proceed within a reasonable window. Ethan shut off the radio, shaking his head. Royals, he muttered to no one in particular. Whole kingdom falling apart because one woman didn't want to marry a stranger for politics. Can't say I blame her. He didn't think much of it beyond that. Royal scandals were the kind of thing that happened to other people, in other kingdoms, far from a manor full of dust sheets and broken astrolabes. He had no idea, of course, that the missing queen was currently in his kitchen, ruining a second batch of bread. It's supposed to rise, Luna said, staring at the flat, sad lump of dough with real betrayal in her voice. Why isn't it rising? Did you use the yeast that's been sitting open in the pantry for 3 years? She paused. Possibly. There's your problem. He was laughing before he could stop himself, and she threw a dish towel at him, laughing too, and for a moment the radio's grim reports of a kingdom in chaos felt like they belonged to an entirely different world. That night, after Luna had gone up to bed, Ethan sat alone by the dying fire and let himself notice, fully, for the first time, exactly how much he'd started to look forward to her company. The quiet manor didn't feel quiet anymore. It felt lived in. It felt like his grandfather's old rule, a house is only a house until someone loves it, had finally come true again. He told himself it was just companionship. He told himself that for another 3 weeks, right up until the evening he found himself standing outside her door at midnight, unable to sleep, just to make sure the light under it meant she was safe and not simply gone, vanished as suddenly as she'd arrived. He didn't say anything to her. He went back to bed. But he knew even then that whatever this was, it had stopped being simple a while ago. The following market day, Ethan rode into town alone to trade for supplies, and found the whole square buzzing with the same rumors he'd heard on the radio, now embellished with the particular relish small towns reserve for royal scandal. A baker swore the Queen had run off with a Scytherin diplomat. A cobbler insisted House Vane had quietly done away with her to clear a path to the throne. An old woman at the well swore, with total confidence, that Queen Selene had been seen disguised as a temple acolyte 3 towns over, though she couldn't say which temple, or which town, or where she'd actually heard this from. Ethan listened to all of it with the mild amusement of a man who assumed none of it had anything to do with him, bought his supplies, and rode home to a maid who greeted him at the gate with dirt on her hands and a smile that made the whole ridiculous, gossiping town fade instantly from his mind. It was a small thing that nearly gave her away, the kind of small thing that, in hindsight, Ethan would replay 100 times. A traveling noble's caravan had broken an axle on the road near the manor, and the noblewoman, a minor lady from one of the border houses, had come to the gate seeking help until repairs could be made. Ethan invited her in for tea while his neighbor fetched a wheelwright from town, and Luna, per her usual duties, served the refreshments. The noblewoman took one look at Luna's posture. The perfectly straight spine, the precise way she set the teacups down, the almost imperceptible half-bow she gave before retreating from the room, and frowned. "Your maid carries herself like she was trained at court," the noblewoman said once Luna had gone, studying Ethan with new interest. "Where did you find her?" "She came looking for work," Ethan said carefully, an odd unease prickling at the back of his neck. "Why?" "No reason. Just an observation." The noblewoman's eyes lingered on the doorway a moment longer than Ethan liked. "You don't see that kind of bearing outside the palace walls very often these days," There was a time every noble daughter in the kingdom was drilled in exactly that posture from the cradle: how to pour, how to bow, how to enter and exit a room without disturbing the air in it. Rarer now. Most of the old families have let the discipline lapse. She sipped her tea, gazed thoughtful. Your maid must have come from a very particular household indeed. Ethan brushed it off at the time. Coincidence, he told himself, just an old habit from wherever Luna had actually grown up. But later that evening, he found her in the garden, kneeling in the dirt among the roses she nursed back from ruin, and the question came out before he could stop it. Luna, where did you really learn to carry yourself like that? She went very still. Trowel paused mid-motion. Like what? Lady Vern said you move like someone trained at court. For a long moment, Luna said nothing at all, and Ethan watched something flicker behind her eyes: fear, calculation, something that looked almost like grief. I told you, she said finally, voice careful. I work somewhere very particular. About a great many things. She resumed digging, a shade too forcefully. It's not a happy story, Ethan. I'd rather not revisit it. He let it drop. Every instinct told him there was more to it. A great deal more. But he'd promised himself he wouldn't push, and he intended to keep that promise even as the unease settled deeper into his chest. 2 days later, another moment nearly cracked the mask entirely. Ethan had left an old news broadcast playing in the workshop while he repaired a clock mechanism, and Luna, passing through with a basket of laundry, stopped dead in the doorway at the sound of the announcer's voice discussing the ongoing search for Queen Feline. Ethan glanced up in time to see her knuckles whiten around the basket's handle, her ears pinned flat, before she composed herself and continued on as though nothing had happened. You all right? He called after her. Fine, she said too quickly. Just thinking of something I need to do. He let it go, though the moment lodged itself uneasily in the back of his mind, one more small piece of a puzzle he hadn't yet realized he was assembling. That night, unable to sleep, he found her sitting alone on the porch steps, staring up at the stars with an expression of such profound loneliness that it stopped him in the doorway. Can't sleep either? He asked softly. She glanced up, and for once she didn't rearrange her face into composure fast enough to hide what he saw there: exhaustion, fear, and something achingly like homesickness for a home she couldn't return to. I keep thinking, she said quietly, about everything I left behind. And whether it was the right choice. Ethan sat down beside her, close but not touching, giving her room. For what it's worth, he said, whatever you left behind, it doesn't seem to be treating you very well, if this is the alternative you chose instead. She let out a small, broken laugh. You have no idea. So tell me. She looked at him for a long moment, gold eyes searching his face in the moonlight, and he thought, he was almost certain, that she was on the verge of telling him everything. Then a distant howl of wind rattled the porch shutters, and the moment broke, and she looked away. Someday, she said. I promise. Just not yet. He didn't push. But he reached over, gently, and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat there together until the moon set, either one saying another word, because none was needed. Whatever it is, Ethan said finally, as she rose to head inside. Whatever you're carrying. It doesn't change how I see you. I hope you know that. She paused in the doorway, looking back at him with an expression he'd carry with him for the rest of his life, equal parts hope and terror, like someone standing at the edge of something enormous and uncertain. I hope so too, Ethan, she said softly. More than you know. The bounty hunters found the manor 3 days later. They didn't announce themselves as bounty hunters, of course. They came dressed as traveling merchants, then as surveyors, then, when those covers proved unconvincing to Ethan's practiced eye, as members of a royal census team asking about the local population. But Ethan had lived alone on the edge of feline territory long enough to know when someone was fishing for information rather than asking for it honestly, and something about the way their eyes lingered on the manor's windows, searching, cataloging, set every nerve in his body on edge. You get a lot of visitors out here? one of them asked, a broad-shouldered man with knights bearing beneath an ill-fitting merchant's coat. Not really, Ethan said evenly. Why do you ask? No reason. Just curious about your household. Do you live alone? I do, Ethan lied, without hesitation, surprising himself with how easily it came. The man's eyes flicked, just once, toward the upstairs window where Ethan knew Luna was watching from behind the curtain, and Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. Of course, the man said smoothly. Apologies for the intrusion. He and his companions left without further comment, but Ethan watched them linger at the tree line at the edge of his property for a long time before finally riding off toward town. He found Luna in the kitchen when he went back inside, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter. Luna! I heard, she said quietly, not turning around. I'm sorry, Ethan. I should go. Tonight before. Before what? He crossed the room, gently turning her to face him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and beneath the fear he saw something else. A terrible, resigned exhaustion, like she'd been running from this exact moment for weeks and had simply run out of road. Before I bring danger to your door, she said. Before they find me and hurt you for hiding me. Luna. His voice was steady, even as his heart hammered. Who are you? She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, something in her had changed. The careful mask she'd worn for weeks finally, fully dissolved, replaced by a weary, aching honesty. My name, she said, isn't Luna. It's Feline. Feline Ashrin. She watched his face carefully, searching for the moment recognition would land. I'm the queen of the Feline Kingdom. The kitchen went very, very quiet. You're... Ethan's voice came out strangled. The queen. The one everyone's looking for. The one who... vanished, yes. Ran away, yes. Left behind an arranged marriage that was supposed to secure peace between two kingdoms, yes. Her chin lifted, some flicker of the regal bearing he'd glimpsed all along finally surfacing fully. I couldn't do it, Ethan. I couldn't spend my entire life bound to a man I don't love, sealing a treaty with my own body like some piece of property to be traded across a border. So I ran. And I found your gate in a thunderstorm, and you took me in without asking a single question, and for the first time in my entire life, I got to just be a person. Burn eggs. Dig in the dirt. Fall in. She stopped herself, cheeks coloring, but Ethan had already heard the words she hadn't quite said, and something in his chest cracked open, hope and terror tangled together so tightly he couldn't tell them apart. Feline, he said softly, testing the true name in his mouth. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because the moment you knew, she said, voice breaking, you'd be in danger. Because I loved, being someone you looked at without seeing a crown. And I was selfish enough to want that to last a little longer. She wiped angrily at her eyes. But it seems my time has run out regardless. I should go. Before those men come back with knights instead of questions. No. The word came out of him before he'd fully decided to say it, firm enough that it startled them both. Ethan. You said it yourself? You ran because you didn't want to be traded like property to secure someone else's peace. So you're not doing that now either. Running off alone into the dark just to protect me from a choice I get to make for myself. He took her hands in his, steady despite the storm of feeling in his chest. Whatever happens next, you're not facing it alone. Not after everything you've given this house. Not after everything you've given me. Tears spilled freely down her face now, and she laughed, a small, disbelieving, hopeful sound. You're an idiot, Ethan Cross. Do you understand what you're risking? I've got a fair idea, he said. I'm risking it anyway. She told him everything that night, sitting together at the kitchen table long after the fire had burned low, the palace she'd grown up in, gilded and suffocating in equal measure, the mother she'd lost to fever when she was 12, leaving her the throne far earlier than any child should inherit such a thing, the years of tutors and etiquette masters who'd shaped her into a queen before she'd ever been allowed to simply be a girl. She told him about the night the betrothal contract was finalized without her input, about staring at Prince Kalen across a formal dinner and feeling nothing but a kind of hollow dread at the thought of spending the rest of her life bound to a stranger for the sake of a border dispute neither of them had started. "I packed one suitcase," she said, staring into her cooling tea. "Climbed out through the servants' passage I'd used as a child to sneak sweets from the kitchen. I didn't even have a plan beyond getting as far from the palace as I could before anyone noticed I was gone. And you ended up here." "I ended up here," she agreed, a small, exhausted smile tugging at her mouth. "The luckiest thunderstorm of my life." They had perhaps 2 days of uneasy peace before the nights came in force. Ethan spent that time in a strange, suspended state. Half of him still reeling at the truth of who had been living under his roof for the past month, half of him simply grateful that the woman across the breakfast table was still, in every way that mattered, the same Luna who burned eggs and talked to roses and laughed at his terrible jokes. Feline, for her part, seemed lighter somehow, as though the unburdening of her secret had lifted a weight she'd carried since the night of the storm. "There's something freeing about being caught," she admitted, kneeling once more in the garden, hands buried in the soil. "I don't have to pretend any more. Whatever comes next, at least it comes honestly." "What happens if they find you?" Ethan asked, watching her work. "Really? What happens?" Feline was quiet for a long moment. "Best case, I'm escorted back to the palace under guard, and the nobles put the crown back on my head and quietly finish arranging the marriage they always intended, treating my little escape as a youthful indiscretion to be forgiven and forgotten." Her jaw tightened. "Worst case, the noble houses currently fighting over my disappearance decide a dead queen is more useful to their ambitions than a living one who might return and reclaim her throne." Ethan's blood ran cold. "Then we don't let them find you." "Ethan." She looked up at him, gold eyes soft with something between affection and sorrow. "They will find me. It's only a matter of time, now that they know to look here. I brought this danger to your door, and I won't let you stand between me and armed knights out of some misplaced sense of chivalry." "It's not misplaced," he said quietly. "It's just how I feel about you. Queen or maid, that hasn't changed since the day you showed up soaking wet asking to dust my shelves." They spent that second day preparing as best they could for whatever came next, not with weapons, since Ethan owned little beyond an old hunting rifle better suited to scaring off foxes than facing armored knights, but with plans. Feline insisted on drafting a letter, in her own hand, addressed to Captain Doran of the Royal Guard, a man she trusted more than most at court, in case matters turned dangerous before she had the chance to speak for herself. Ethan spent the afternoon reinforcing the manor's old gate, more out of restless need to do something with his hands than any real belief it would hold against determined knights. "You don't have to do any of this," Feline told him quietly, watching him work. "I know," Ethan said, not looking up from the hinge he was tightening. "I'm doing it anyway." She rose from the dirt, closing the distance between them, and for the first time since the thunderstorm that had brought her to his gate, she kissed him, soft, uncertain, achingly sincere, and Ethan understood, with total clarity, exactly what he was willing to fight for. The knights arrived the following dawn. Ethan heard the hoofbeats before he saw them. A full column of royal cavalry cresting the hill road, banners snapping in the wind, the Feline Kingdom's crest unmistakable, even at a distance. He and Feline stood together at the manor's front gate as the column drew to a halt, a dozen armored knights fanning out to encircle the property, spears and energy lances at the ready, commanded by a stern-faced captain whose eyes went wide with recognition the moment they landed on Feline. "Your Majesty," the captain breathed, dropping instantly to one knee, the rest of the column following suit in a ripple of clattering armor. "Thank the ancestors. We feared the worst. Captain Doran?" Feline's voice had transformed in an instant, the same steady authority Ethan had glimpsed in stolen fragments over the past month, now fully unveiled, commanding and unmistakably royal. I trust you've come to escort me home rather than drag me there. Whatever your Majesty commands, the captain said carefully, rising. Though I must inform you, the situation at the palace has grown dire in your absence. House Kestrel and House Vane are on the brink of open conflict over the succession. Prince Kaelin's father has threatened to consider the broken betrothal an act of war unless the marriage proceeds as planned within the month. He hesitated, glancing at Ethan with poorly concealed suspicion. And who is this? This, Feline said, and Ethan felt her hand find his, fingers lacing together in full view of a dozen armored knights. Is Ethan Cross, the man whose home I have called my own for the past month. The man I intend to remain beside, regardless of what the noble houses or the Drummer Prince have to say about it. A murmur rippled through the assembled knights. Captain Doran's expression flickered between alarm and genuine uncertainty. Your Majesty, he said carefully, with respect. The kingdom is on the verge of civil war. The peace treaty with the Drummer depends on this marriage. If you return and refuse the betrothal now, publicly, with a commoner at your side, then I will face that consequence honestly. Feline said, chin lifted, every inch the Queen Ethan had never seen but had somehow always sensed beneath the maid's apron. I refused the marriage weeks ago, Captain, at considerable personal cost. I did not run from my throne to reclaim it only to surrender the one freedom I actually found while I was gone. Captain Doran studied her for a long, weighing moment, and something in his stern expression finally softened, not agreement exactly, but respect. Then I suggest, Your Majesty, that whatever you intend to say to the noble houses, you say it in person, and soon. Rumors are one thing. A queen's own voice is another. He glanced meaningfully at the knights around him, then back to her. The people have been frightened for weeks, wondering if you were alive at all. Perhaps it's time they heard the truth from you directly. All of it. Feline looked at Ethan. He squeezed her hand. Whatever you decide, he said quietly. I'm with you. She took a breath, and for the first time since the night of the thunderstorm, she looked less like a runaway and more like a monarch preparing to reclaim her throne on her own terms. Then let's go finish what I started, Captain, she said. All the way to the palace steps. The journey to the capital took the better part of 2 days, and Ethan spent most of it in a state of quiet disbelief, riding in a royal carriage flanked by knights, watching the countryside he'd never once left roll past the window while the woman beside him transformed, mile by mile, into someone he barely recognized and yet somehow already loved completely. Feline used the journey to prepare. Reviewing reports Captain Doran had smuggled to her about the current state of the noble houses, drafting and redrafting the speech she intended to give, occasionally lapsing into long silences where Ethan could see her steeling herself for whatever awaited them at the palace. Tell me about him, Ethan said on the second evening, as they made camp at a way station along the royal road. Prince Kaelin. What's he actually like? Feline considered the question. Stern. Dutiful. Not unkind, as far as I could tell, though we'd barely spoken more than a handful of times before the betrothal was finalized. I don't think he wanted this marriage any more than I did. I always got the sense he was as much a pawn in his father's ambitions as I was in my own counsels. She stared into the campfire. That almost made it worse, somehow. Knowing neither of us had chosen this, and being expected to build a life together anyway, as though love were simply a formality that would sort itself out after the contracts were signed. And now? Now I intend to find out whether he's brave enough to want something different too. She glanced at Ethan, firelight catching the gold of her eyes. For both our sakes. Captain Doran, keeping watch at the edge of the firelight, cleared his throat diplomatically. If I may, Your Majesty. The prince has sent no fewer than 3 private messages to the palace since your disappearance, each one asking after your safety rather than the state of the treaty. I don't believe he's the villain the noble houses would have you fear. Feline raised an eyebrow. You've been reading my private correspondence, Captain? I've been keeping you alive, Your Majesty, Doran said with the ghost of a smile. Sometimes those tasks overlap. They reached the outskirts of the capital by mid-afternoon of the second day, and Ethan felt his stomach tighten as the city's spires came into view, soaring towers of pale stone, banners of a dozen noble houses snapping from countless rooftops, the great palace itself rising above it all like something out of the storybooks his grandmother used to read him as a child. He had never in his life imagined he would ride through those gates beside the woman he loved, both of them bracing for a confrontation that would decide the fate of two kingdoms. "Second thoughts?" Feline asked quietly, watching his face. "Not about you," Ethan said. "Just about everything else." She took his hand as the carriage rolled through the city gates, and did not let go. The great hall of the Feline Palace had not seen a gathering this tense in a generation. Word of the Queen's return had spread through the capital like wildfire the moment her carriage passed through the city gates, Ethan riding at her side despite the scandalized whispers that followed them the entire way. By the time they reached the palace, the great hall had filled with nearly every noble house in the kingdom, along with a grim-faced delegation from the Dramer territories led by Prince Feline himself. A broad, stone-featured young man whose expression shifted from relief to confusion to open displeasure as he took in the sight of Queen Feline entering on the arm of an unremarkable human commoner. "Your Majesty," Prince Feline said stiffly, bowing with rigid formality. "We feared you'd been taken from us. I'm relieved to see you well." His eyes flicked pointedly to Ethan. "Though I confess I don't understand the circumstances of your return." Feline released Ethan's arm and stepped forward alone, ascending the dais to stand before the assembled houses, and when she spoke, her voice carried through the hall with the effortless authority of someone who had been born to command a room and had simply, for one brief month, chosen not to. "Lords, ladies, honored guests of House Dramer," she began. "I owe this kingdom an explanation, and I intend to give it honestly, without the polished half-truths this court has grown so accustomed to." A tense hush fell over the hall. "Weeks ago, I left this palace rather than proceed with a marriage arranged to secure peace between our kingdoms, a peace I do not dispute is valuable, and a sacrifice I do not dispute many before me have made. But I could not do it. Not because I do not love my people, and not because I do not understand the cost of failing to secure that peace. I left because I refuse to believe that peace and my own freedom to choose who I love must always be mutually exclusive things." Murmurs rippled through the noble houses. Prince Kaylin's jaw tightened. "In my absence," Feline continued, "I found shelter in the home of a human named Ethan Cross, who took in a stranger from a thunderstorm without asking a single question of her worth, her bloodline, or her usefulness to his ambitions. For the first time in my life, I was permitted to simply be, not a crown, not a treaty, not a piece to be moved across a board by men who have never once asked what I actually want. And in that month, I found something this palace, for all its splendor, never gave me." She turned, gold eyes finding Ethan across the hall. "I found love, freely given and freely returned, asking nothing of me but my honest self." The hall had gone utterly silent now. "I understand the stakes," Feline said, turning back to the assembled nobles, voice hardening with resolve. "I understand that Dramer and feline blood has spilled across our shared border for generations, and that this marriage was meant to end it. But I refuse to believe that the only path to peace between our peoples runs through my own unwilling heart. If war must be threatened because a queen chooses to love where she wishes rather than where she's told, then perhaps it's not peace this alliance was ever truly built upon, only convenience, dressed up in ceremony." She let the silence hang a moment longer before continuing. "So here is my declaration, before every house assembled in this hall. I will not proceed with a marriage I do not want, to secure a peace built on my own captivity. If that costs me this crown, I will surrender it. Gladly, rather than surrender the one true freedom I found in a stranger's manner. But I do not believe it must cost me the crown at all. I believe this kingdom is capable of finding peace with the Dramer through honest diplomacy rather than a queen traded like currency. And I intend to prove it, if the houses of this court are willing to work beside me rather than simply expect my obedience." For a long moment, nothing happened. Ethan's heart hammered so hard he was certain the entire hall could hear it. Then, to everyone's visible shock, it was Prince Kalen who broke the silence, stepping forward, his stern features softening into something almost like relief. "Your Majesty," he said slowly, "I confess I did not want this marriage any more than you did. It was arranged between our fathers before either of us had any say in the matter. If there is another path to peace between our peoples, one that doesn't require either of us to surrender our own hearts, I would welcome it gladly." He glanced, almost apologetically, at Ethan. "I have no wish to stand between a queen and the man who clearly makes her happier than any political marriage ever could." The tension in the hall broke like a dam giving way, murmurs rising into genuine discussion, and Feline let out a breath Ethan suspected she'd been holding for weeks. House Kestrel's elder matriarch rose next, her expression severe but not unkind. "Your Majesty's honesty is unconventional for this court. But perhaps that is precisely what this kingdom has needed for some time. I move that the Council draft new terms of alliance with House Dromer, terms built on trade, shared defense, and mutual interest, rather than a single unwilling bride." Not every voice in the hall rose in agreement. A representative from House Vane, a sharp-featured lord who had spent the Queen's absence quietly consolidating support for a regency council of his own choosing, rose with visible reluctance. "Your Majesty's sentiment is admirable," he said, in a tone that suggested he founded nothing of the sort. "But sentiment does not secure a border. What guarantee does this council have that House Dromer will honor a treaty built on trade agreements alone, without the binding weight of royal marriage?" "The guarantee," Prince Kalen said before Feline could answer, "of my own word, Lord Vane, and my father's signature alongside it. My house does not go back on treaties simply because they lack a wedding to dress them up. If that isn't enough for House Vane, I invite you to say so plainly, rather than hiding the accusation in a question." Lord Vane's mouth thinned, but he said nothing further, and Ethan caught the look Feline gave the prince. Genuine gratitude, the first real warmth he'd seen pass between the two of them. More voices rose in agreement after that, and Ethan watched, half in disbelief, as centuries of rigid tradition began, slowly and unevenly, to bend. Feline descended the dais and crossed the hall to where he stood, and in front of the entire assembled nobility of the Feline Kingdom, she took his hands in hers. "I told you I'd finish what I started," she said softly, eyes bright with unshed tears. "You didn't just finish it," Ethan murmured. "You rewrote the whole thing." The declaration in the Great Hall did not end the matter overnight, however much Ethan might have hoped otherwise. In the weeks that followed, the palace became a battleground of a quieter, more exhausting kind. Councils and committees drafted treaties and countered proposals, House Vane's faction working every private channel available to reintroduce the marriage question by other means, dressed up as concerns over succession or border security or a dozen other polite fictions. Feline met every challenge with the same steady patience Ethan had come to recognize from her weeks tending the garden, treating each new obstacle as simply another weed to be pulled, another bed to be turned before something better could grow in its place. Ethan, for his part, found himself in the strange position of being both entirely out of his depth and, in his own quiet way, essential to the process. He had no title, no bloodline, no experience navigating the labyrinth of court politics. But he had spent a lifetime coaxing broken machines back into working order, patiently identifying which small adjustment would set the whole mechanism right again, and he found, to his own surprise, that court politics wasn't so different in principle. "You're doing that thing again," Feline told him one evening, finding him hunched over a stack of council reports she'd left on the study desk, red ink marking up a trade proposal between the Feline Kingdom and the Dromer territories. "What thing?" "Fixing things that aren't yours to fix." But she was smiling as she said it, settling into the chair across from him. "What have you found?" "This clause here," Ethan said, tapping the page. "It reads like it favors the Dromer on iron tariffs, but if you flip the language slightly, tie it to shared infrastructure investment instead of a flat percentage, both sides come out ahead." It's the same trick as fixing a gear ratio. You're not removing friction, you're redistributing it so the whole system runs smoother. Feline stared at him for a long moment, something unreadable and fond in her expression. You know, she said finally, most consorts in this kingdom's history contributed nothing more to statecraft than their bloodline and their silence. Well, Ethan said, I never was very good at keeping quiet when something's broken and I can see the fix. She laughed, reaching across the desk to take his hand, and later that proposal, with Ethan's suggested language nearly intact, became one of the founding terms of the new Feline Drama Trade Accord. House Vane's faction did not give up easily. Twice more over the following months, Lord Vane attempted to reintroduce doubts about the Queen's judgment, once suggesting publicly that a monarch, distracted by a commoner's affections, could not be trusted to properly weigh the kingdom's interests, a remark that earned him an icy dressing down from House Kestrel's matriarch, who had, somewhat to everyone's surprise, become one of Feline's staunchest defenders. I have watched this kingdom's queens marry for duty for 4 generations, the old matriarch said, in a council session Ethan happened to witness from the gallery. I have watched what that duty costs, in queens who governed brilliantly and died lonely, having never once been permitted to love anyone at all. If Her Majesty has found a way to serve her people without paying that particular price, I count that a mercy this court has long been overdue, not a scandal to be managed. Lord Vane did not raise the objection again after that. Slowly, unevenly, the kingdom adjusted. The formal trade and defense accord with House Dromer was signed within 4 months of Feline's return, its terms stronger and more mutually beneficial than the original marriage contract had ever been, according to Prince Kaelin himself, who visited the palace twice more that year and struck up what became, against every expectation, a genuine friendship with both Feline and Ethan. I confess, Kaelin admitted, during one such visit, watching Ethan attempt, and fail, to teach him the basics of repairing a broken clock mechanism in the palace workshop. When I first met you in that hall, I assumed the Queen had lost her senses entirely. A commoner, no title, no bloodline to speak of. And now? Ethan asked, not looking up from the gears. Now I think perhaps my father and I were fools to believe a treaty needed a wedding at all, when clearly what secures a lasting peace is simply 2 people willing to be honest with one another. Kaelin turned the tiny screwdriver over in his stone-gray hands with evident bemusement. Though I still don't understand how you manage this. It's like trying to perform surgery on something the size of my thumbnail. Patience, Ethan said, grinning. And a steady hand? Same as diplomacy, from what I've seen. Not all of Ethan's adjustment to palace life was so smooth. He struggled, in those early months, with the sheer scrutiny of being seen, every meal watched by curious staff, every word he exchanged with Feline analyzed by courtiers hungry for gossip, every misstep magnified by his unfamiliarity with 100 unspoken rules of etiquette he'd never needed to learn in his quiet manner. There were nights he found himself missing the simple anonymity of his old life so fiercely it ached, and he said as much to Feline one evening, half ashamed of the admission. I feel like a gear that doesn't fit the mechanism, he told her. Everyone here moves like they were built for this. I'm just improvising. Feline took his hand, gold eyes steady on his. Ethan, do you know what I loved most about that month in your manor? Burning bread? Besides that. She smiled, but it faded quickly into something more serious. I loved that you never once made me feel like I had to perform for you. That I could fail at something as simple as eggs and you'd only ever laugh with me, never at me. She squeezed his hand. So let me return the favor. You don't have to perform for this court either. You only have to be exactly who you already are. That's who I fell in love with, and that's who this kingdom will learn to love too, in time. It didn't happen all at once. But slowly, over that first difficult year, Ethan found his footing, not by becoming someone else, but simply by continuing to be himself amid all the finery and formality, fixing what he could fix and admitting honestly what he couldn't, until the same steady, unassuming decency that had once won over a runaway queen began, gradually, to win over her court as well. It took the better part of a year for the dust to fully settle. The new alliance between the Feline Kingdom and the Drommer territories was hammered out over months of careful negotiation, trade agreements, shared border patrols, a joint council to mediate future disputes, built not on the sacrifice of a single unwilling heart but on the harder, slower work of genuine diplomacy. Prince Kalen, true to his word, proved an unexpectedly gracious partner in the process, and he and Feline settled into something like real friendship once the shadow of an unwanted marriage no longer hung between them. The noble houses did not universally embrace the change. There were factions who muttered for months about tradition and precedent, about a queen who'd chosen a commoner, worse, a human, over centuries of royal protocol. But Feline weathered the criticism with the same steady resolve she'd shown in the Great Hall, and slowly, unevenly, the kingdom came to see what Ethan had known since the night of the thunderstorm, that she led better as herself, unburdened, than she ever had wearing the mask the crown demanded of her. She did not abandon the throne. That much surprised Ethan, though perhaps it shouldn't have. For all her longing to escape it, Feline loved her people fiercely, and once she'd proven that duty and freedom needn't be enemies, she settled into her role as queen with a warmth and honesty the court hadn't seen from its monarchy in generations. She began holding open council sessions where ordinary citizens could bring grievances directly to the crown, a practice unheard of in the kingdom's rigid history, and within the year, public sentiment toward her, battered briefly by the scandal of her disappearance, had swelled into something approaching genuine adoration. But she did not abandon the manor either. "You're the queen of an entire kingdom," Ethan pointed out one evening, watching her kneel in the garden that had, over the past year, become fully hers, roses climbing the old stone wall, herbs thriving in neat rows she'd learned to tend with real skill. "You could live anywhere. Rebuild any palace when you wanted. Why do you still insist on driving 3 hours out to weed a garden yourself?" Feline glanced up at him, dirt smudged across one cheek, gold eyes soft with a contentment he'd never once seen on her in that great hall full of nobles and banners. "Because this," she said, gesturing at the manor behind them, "is the only place I've ever been simply Feline. Not the queen. Not a treaty. Not a crown to be traded across a border." She rose, brushing off her hands, and crossed to where he stood. "I have a palace for the queen. I intend to keep a home for the woman." They split their time between the two, in the end, weeks at the palace when matters of state demanded it, weeks back at the manor when they could steal the freedom for it, Captain Doran eventually growing so accustomed to the arrangement that he simply kept a small honor guard permanently stationed discreetly at the edge of the property, more out of habit than any real concern for danger. Ethan continued his work with the antique machines, though he found his afternoons increasingly occupied with council reports and trade proposals as well, an unofficial advisor whose engineering mind for finding the elegant fix in a tangled mechanism proved, again and again, unexpectedly useful in matters of state. They were married the following spring. Not in the palace's great hall, with its banners and its centuries of rigid ceremony, but in the manor's overgrown garden, under a canopy of climbing roses Feline had nursed back from ruin with her own 2 hands. Captain Doran stood as an unlikely witness alongside a handful of palace staff who had, over the past year, come to genuinely adore their queen's unconventional choice. Prince Kalen sent his congratulations from the Drommer valleys, along with a peace offering of rare stoneflower seeds for the garden that had, in some strange way, changed the fate of 2 kingdoms. Even House Kestrel's elder matriarch made the long journey out to attend, declaring, with characteristic bluntness, that she wouldn't miss the wedding that finally dragged this court out of the Dark Ages for anything short of my own funeral. The ceremony itself was small and quiet, exactly as Feline had wanted it, no grand processions, no state banquets, just the people who had actually stood beside her through the upheaval of the past year, gathered in a garden that had once been wild and forgotten and was now, in every sense, alive. Ethan wore his grandfather's old coat, mended and pressed for the occasion. Feline wore a simple gown of pale gold that matched her eyes, with none of the ceremonial jewels the court had tried, unsuccessfully, to insist upon. That evening, as the wedding guests finally departed and the manor settled back into its familiar quiet, Ethan and Feline sat together on the back porch, mugs of tea cooling between them, watching the twin moons rise over the hills exactly as they had that first thunderstorm night, a lifetime and no time at all ago. "Any regrets, Your Majesty?" Ethan asked, bumping his shoulder gently against hers. Feline considered the question with the same careful seriousness she brought to matters of state, then shook her head, resting against him with a smile that held nothing guarded in it at all. "Only that I didn't burn my first batch of eggs sooner," she said. "I might have found my way to your gate years earlier." Ethan laughed, pulling her closer, and above them the stars wheeled on, indifferent to crowns and treaties and all the centuries of careful tradition that had, in the end, bent quietly around one simple, stubborn truth, that even a queen, especially a queen, deserved the right to choose the life and the love that made her whole.